It has to be a tough challenge if you're a parent trying to navigate the stormy waters of modern education. It seems as if there's a new insanity every day that pops up, whether it's critical race theory and revisionist teaching of history, or climate alarmism, or social justice math. It's a whack-a-mole game. There's no way to keep up. But there is a root to all these problems, these modern corruptions in education. To successfully diagnose them and to do battle with them in order to take action, we first have to understand where it all comes from. And the one thing they have all in common is the ideology of the 19th century political philosopher Karl Marx. Who was Karl Marx and what were his main ideas? How did these ideas metastasize into the never-ending stream of insanities? And more importantly, how did that change education? We discuss all these things on this episode of the Rational Educator podcast. If you like what you're hearing from us, check out our website, rationaleducator.com, where we provide the latest news in the world of education. Email us at info@rationaleducator.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Parler, and Rumble. And as always, hit that like button, share with your friends, and make sure you subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. Andy Bernstein, what can you tell us about Karl Marx? What were his major ideas? What's his history? And how did he influence the generations to come after him?
Well, Marx was a German philosopher. His dates were 1818 to 1883. Some people have this, Joel, some people, and Dr. D, some people have this idea that Marx was an economist because his work on capital is famous, although probably nobody's read it.
Nobody's read it.
That's what they say. That's what they say. Marxists have it on their shelves, to show that there's an answer in there somewhere, but nobody actually reads Das Kapital. But Marx was trained in philosophy, his PhD in philosophy from a German university. He's very much in the tradition of Kant and Hegel, certainly morally and politically. The idea that duty to the state is morally imperative. The state is all powerful. Individuals exist to serve the state. They don't have a right to their own life. Their life belongs to the state. He's very much in that German school of philosophy. Marx's contribution, if we can call it that, to the history of philosophy is he sees history and all societies in terms of class struggle. That is the only class versus the working class, or the rich versus the poor. And the key point that Marx emphasizes that is enormously influential in our day in the school system, as we'll discuss, is the idea that society is divided into the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, Marx defined the oppressor and the oppressed very narrowly in terms of economic class, the rich versus the poor, the owning versus the working class. But to Marx, this is what drives history forward, is the class war, the class struggle between rich and poor. The rich are struggling to gain more wealth and power off the blood, sweat, and tears of the exploited workers, and the poor workers are struggling just to survive. And that's Marx's major contribution to the history of philosophy. And of course, we know the impact it's had in society. All communist countries are founded on Marxist theory, starting with Lenin and Trotsky in the Soviet Union, and continuing to this day in North Korea and China and Venezuela and Cuba. There may be different permutations or different versions of communism, but it's all grounded in Marx's philosophy. I should also say, before we go to Dr. D, Marx is a philosophic materialist, which is also important. And it's a very simple theory in philosophy. Everything's matter. One thing you can say about materialism, it's simple. It's completely unable to explain the human mind, thoughts, and emotions, but leave that aside for just a second. The theory is simple. Everything is matter, and so we're bodies, and that's also part of we're bodies and nothing more. And the mind is nothing but, to sophisticated materialists, the mind is nothing but neurons firing in the brain, or electrical discharges up and down the nervous system, or glandular squirtings, as Leonard Peikoff once put it in an immortal phrase. But we're nothing but bodies. And consequently, but I'll wrap it up with this. How does that make us different from barnyard animals, oxen or horses? Well, we're just more sophisticated biological systems. And how do you get barnyard animals to work? Well, you whip them, or you dig your spurs into their sides. You use physical force against them. And so it's on Marxist theory, it's plausible to think that you can combine totalitarianism and slave labor with prosperity. They're just bodies. We're just bodies. Just whip them to work, use massive slave labor, and you can create wealth. And that's all communist societies have used massive slave labor. They still do. The Gulag system is filled with slave labor, people who are in many cases political prisoners, have done nothing wrong other than maybe criticize the regime, or maybe just have been suspected of criticizing the regime. One thing, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, he's talking about the slave labor in the Soviet, gulags or slave labor camps that I remember, is cattle prods. They use cattle prods on human beings, shooting all these volts of electricity they used to get cattle to move, using them on human slave labor. That's communist practice based on Marxist theory. So I think that's a good start for us.
Yeah. Now, before we move on from Marx, it's pretty clear, if that's where his philosophical underpinnings come from, that it would result in a dehumanizing effect on its adherents. But what I'd like to know is, and we didn't really talk about this in our show prep, but what I'd like to know is, what's the attraction to Marx? Why are his arguments and his ideas so weirdly evergreen? Like, why do they propagate throughout history? Now, there's one thing that I frequently see with his conception of this framework of the oppressed versus the oppressors. And one thing that continually comes up in Marxists over the years is that there's a great deal of envy and resentment built into their attraction to the idea. It's almost like they're compelled or attracted because it offers a philosophical justification for their anger and resentment. But maybe you can speak a little bit to that and answer why it is that it continues to propagate throughout the last, century and a half or so.
No, I was thinking exactly that, Joel. It reminds me, the three of us are admirers of Ayn Rand, of her novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and her philosophy of objectivism. And Ayn Rand, of course, stands for the reasoning mind and individual rights and capitalism. And she wrote a brilliant essay, The Age of Envy, I think, which is relevant here. And certainly, I think she discusses this throughout her great novel, Atlas Shrugged. There's a certain mentality that just hates successful people, that just hates, people who've done well and desires to tear them down.
And that describes Marx himself too, by the way.
He was an angry person from all, from all accounts. Yeah, let me tell a joke here, because I think it captures the essence of it. Somebody told me this. I spent a year in Bulgaria teaching at the American University there about 5 years ago, and it was a Bulgarian who told me this joke about Bulgarian culture. And he said, the devil, approaches the two individuals. One's American, one's Bulgarian, and says, "Look, I give you anything you want. You just have to understand, I'm going to double it for your worst enemy." And so, the American thinks about it and says, "Oh, all right, well, I'll take $25 billion. If my worst enemy is 50 billion, okay, I'll live with that, because with 25 billion, I can do all these good things for myself and my family and everything." Okay, the Bulgarian, said, "Well, what about you? What do you want? Anything you want, but I'm going to double it for your worst enemy." And the Bulgarian said, "Put out one of my eyes." I mean, there's a certain mentality. And the Bulgarian dude who told me this was saying this was indicative of a mentality in Bulgarian culture. There's a certain mentality that wants to tear down others, especially if they're successful. They often call it the crab bucket syndrome. Evidently, if you have a bunch of crabs in a bucket and one of them tries to climb out, the other crabs will pull them back down into the bucket. God forbid one of them rises above the other crabs. There's this kind of mentality that wants to destroy especially successful people. And I think that's the essence of Marxism. To me, Marxism is a philosophy of, for, and by envy-ridden, psychopathic, wannabe mass murderers. And you just look at some of the things that they do. Mao turned over the culture basically to the Red Guards. These 12-year-old kids, beating up and murdering, in some cases, their teachers, college professors, just unleashing this rage towards people who were more accomplished. Another example of that would be the Nazis, although they weren't Marxists. They would fight race war, not class war. But I think the same envy-ridden mentality. I mean, why hate the Jews? In Germany, I mean, the Jews tended to be educated and prosperous, unlike, say, in Eastern Europe. But here's the leitmotif of envy-ridden nihilism. And nihilism is the desire to destroy, to tear down values rather than to build up. The Nazis, end of the war, the Western allies are closing in from the West, the Soviets are closing in from the East. They need their trains to bring supplies and men to both fronts. But they did it. They hastened, they shipped as many Jews as they can to the death camps, and used their train power, which was deprived then, of bringing supplies and food and to their soldiers. It weakened their resistance, but that's okay as long as we kill all the Jews and we rid the world of them. There's that mentality. That's what Marxism is all about. Eat the rich, right? You see the Antifa signs: kill the rich, eat the rich. There's this hate, especially under capitalism. If you're under feudalism, where the rich get rich by exploiting the serfs, under slavery, the rich get rich by victimizing the slaves, you can understand it. But under capitalism, I mean, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, they didn't make their money mostly by exploiting their workers, if they exploited their workers at all. They made their money by being innovative, creators who flooded the world with inexpensive steel products and petroleum products and software and Amazon is an amazing company. That's how they get their money, but it doesn't matter. The Marxist mentality is they're rich, I'm not, I freaking hate them, and let's destroy them. It's an envy-ridden nihilism. It's a destruction for its own sake.
One little comment about what Andy was saying is that Marx didn't necessarily make his own way. He pretty much mooched off of others.
Yeah, he was a parasite who lived off of his relatives and his collaborator, Engels.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that he comes up with this theory about, the evils of the people that have, but he's not, sort of practicing what he preaches, which is pretty interesting, I think.
And let me give another example that shows who these people are. Early days of the Soviet Union under Lenin. This comes out of the Black Book of Communism, which is a very good book. I would recommend to the audience if you.
Who's the author?
Stéphane Courtois.
Okay.
And a series of authors who wrote the essays in there. By the way, everybody out there in rational educator land, you want to read the Black Book of Communism, you need a strong stomach, because the subtitle tells it what it is. What is it? Crimes, Terror, Repression. I think that's the subtitle. Well, yeah, that's the history of communism. And one example that comes to my mind, circa 1920, maybe the Russian Revolution is still going on. The secret police have rounded up all of these bourgeois women, the wives of various, owning class. And first, they made them, clean get on their hands and knees and scrub the toilets of the secret police. Then they gang raped, they mass raped these women. Then they put a bullet in the back of each of their heads, and then they threw them into a mass unmarked grave. Now tell me, how does that promote the workers' revolution? How is that going to make the workers' life better? Abusing and murdering, any number of middle class and upper class women. It doesn't advance the cause of the workers. It's just pure envy-ridden hatred because these women had lived large. They had lived prosperous. Like now, maybe in Russia under the Tsars, which was a monarchy and an aristocracy, maybe they had persecuted the lower classes to get rich. Russia wasn't a free country, so there may well have been some basis for that kind of class hatred, unlike say in the capitals. Nevertheless, that is just gratuitous, murderous violence.
So we're here in the middle of Marx's own life, and how do we get from? Because we know that the cultural change happens in steps, and Marx's influence in the United States in particular came about through the universities, but there were also intermediate steps that changed Marx's ideas to make them palatable for successive generations. So, Deanna, you know a little bit about some of the transitions that took place in the early part of around 1920s and 30s or so in Europe.
Definitely. Well, there's it's the key player here that takes us from Marx to what happens, particularly in America in the time frame, the 20s and 30s. There's an important figure in Italy named Antonio Gramsci, and he's born 1891 and lives until about 1937. And he is a journalist and an activist and head of the Communist Party in Italy. So if you know your history of the early 20th century, what's going on in Italy in this time period, in the 20s or so? Fascism. And we know that fascists and communists don't like each other. So he's imprisoned, and he actually dies young because of some health problems that he acquired while in prison. But while he's there, he writes his ideas down, and these are called the prison notebooks. And he is what we would call a neo-Marxist. So he takes what Marx came up with and kind of spins it in his own way, and what his contribution and really what happens after this and how we get to where we are today with Marxism being so rampant in education is really him, because he looks at what Marx does and he starts applying it to culture and education. And so we have this idea of this sort of sociology of culture coming out of what Gramsci is saying. And he, not only is he looking at the state and the economy and power relations, he's pulling society into this, and culture particularly. And so he really is kind of the father of these cultural studies, what would become sociology, and then part of what's anthropology that's called cultural anthropology. And so his idea of bringing in, using Marxist theory about the worker and the state and all of this,
but
and
really
then
power dynamics of
the power dynamics. He's applying that to culture. And what one of the main things that he talks about is this cultural hegemony. And basically that it doesn't matter what society tries to do, the state is always the one in power. And no matter what's going on in culture, you cannot win. There's nothing you can do. And so you start seeing, like, he believes that the government has these social institutions that are socializing people, education, and there's nothing you can do to fight it. And so you are sort of this social victim, if you will, and that it's through this socialization that the people just kind of submit to the dominant group, and in his case is the state. And so he is really an important thinker. Now, what comes after him is what we call the Frankfurt School. And this is when philosophers and educators come from Germany into America and start teaching at these universities and these colleges. And so what we see with the Frankfurt School is that they're taking these ideas from Europe, and then they're starting to infiltrate American institutions. And this is going to continue to spread. And this idea of this social hegemony and Marxism and Neomarxism, this is coming along with them. And these ideas just start inculcating all of education. And you have to think, because, I mean, we talked about the Prussian system in our previous podcast, that you now have teachers that have to be specifically trained to teach. They're coming out of teachers' colleges. And some of these Europeans that came over here are teaching in the teachers' colleges. And so they're training the next generations of teachers with this sort of, these ideas coming from Marx.
The addition that these thinkers made to Marx and Marx's ideology, it sounds like, and you can confirm this or not, that it added a level of impossibility of a final reward to revolution. Let me tell you what I mean by that. A lot of the classical Marxists, a lot of the early communists believed that they could impose a revolution by force, but then because human beings were predisposed to living according to Marx's ideal, that eventually the state would, quote, wither away.
Yeah.
And because Marxism was the proper state and natural state of man, that by couching this whole power dynamic struggle in terms of not class, as Marx did, but by society and culture, and furthermore, making it immovable, that there was a permanent sort of victim mentality that would be imposed on the oppressed in this construct. Is that fair to say?
With the Frankfurt School, you get the first sort of critical theory, and this isn't critical race theory. We're not there yet. This is happening 1929 and 1930. And so you get those Europeans coming over, particularly from Germany, of Marcuse, I think Horkheimer, and there's about 6 or 7 main guys, and they come up with this idea of critical theory. And what they're trying to do is apply this Marxist, this neo-Marxism, to anything having to do with this with basically society. And what they do is that they don't want to just like sort of empower people or give people, something, to maybe think about. They really want to, what in their words, seek what they call human emancipation. And what that means is emancipate all humans from any sort of dominance or oppression. And that is the base of this critical theory. And this is what they're really teaching. And they're teaching it in history with like the history of, the philosophical underpinnings in history. You see it in some of the legal schools very early on, and then it just starts spreading across into these more sort of social classes like sociology and these other disciplines. And what they also do is that they argue that they have the moral case, that because they are fighting to emancipate humans, all humans, from any sort of oppression, they have the moral high ground. And you can't argue against that. And that's important because that is something that's really prominent today. And so you have these thinkers that are in these colleges making these arguments, kind of telling that this is the history of all humankind, and you're basically going to be breaking down into, you have oppressors and then you have those that are oppressed. And this comes from this critical theory idea from this Frankfurt school as early as 1929. And it's so then that's just going to evolve over time as we go through the 20th century, and we have new philosophical ideas, new issues in society, particularly in America, with race and gender. And as these things come to play, this theory becomes more and more prominent.
But we're not there yet, right?
No.
In our story, we're not quite there yet. This is a relatively narrow definition of what the power dynamics are. This is about oppressors and the oppressed. And I think it sounds like the key takeaway from this is that the oppressors cannot be saved by removing obstructions and allowing them to flourish on their own. It sounds like they can only be helped, they can only be served by tearing down the oppressors, and by it sounds like an early kind of theoretical reparations theory.
I definitely think, I mean, that's what it is that it's about emancipation. So, and it's not, they say it's about emancipation, but really it is about tearing down those oppressors. So if you're oppressed, you can't, rise up. It's not about the individual. And they specifically say this in some of these early writings by these theorists, that it's not about, sort of empowering the individual to rise up. As Dr. Andy said, that crab in the bucket analogy is great, because it's, it's not leading by example amongst these oppressed peoples where you could have one person to rise up and, fight behind the cause. It's more about tearing down. And then again, that's Marxism too, right?
This brings up to about the middle of the 20th century. And you mentioned that there was yet another edition before we get to where we are today in the philosophers of the postmodern schools. So, Andy, this is your kind of studied topic. So, what can you tell us about postmodernism?
You don't want to know, but you asked. I'll make a couple of prior points, because Dr. D, made a good point how the Frankfurt School of Marxists, they were opposed to anybody being, under dominance and oppression while they were supporting the Soviet Union. I mean, you gotta love, the dishonesty and the hypocrisy here. But the postmodernist philosophers, Richard Rorty in the United States, I think he taught at Harvard for a while, as well as other schools, and in France, of course, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. These are the big names in the postmodernist school, and it's Marxism. I mean, there's a couple of points, 2 points I think I'd want to make. One is, again, we see society in terms of the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, Marx, as we pointed out, defined that narrowly in terms of an economic class struggle between the rich and the poor. The postmodernists broaden that enormously to look at history and this struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed much more widely. Men oppress women, whites oppress non-whites, straights oppress gays. Today, everybody oppresses transgenders, especially especially those evil white males, and so. That's a key point that the postmodernists have greatly broadened and deepened and widened the construal of the struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed. Everything in Western society under capitalism is designed to benefit whites and males to the detriment of everybody else. And so we have to fight against that. We have to fight against white privilege, male privilege. That's social justice requires us to jump into the fray on the side of the oppressed against the oppressor. That's one key point here. And then the other key point is what you were saying before, Joel, and that is there's no way to reason this out. And there's no way to reason with the oppressor and arrive at some negotiated settlement that could avert struggle. And the reason, and ultimately force, postmodernists are very clear on this. Force is the only thing that resolves these kinds of dispute. And Marx's term, revolution, bloody revolution. But the reason for that is we have to get into the weeds here in philosophy and make it, because we know a lot of people in the audience perhaps haven't studied philosophy, so we want to keep it simple. This goes back to Kant and Hegel, German philosophers prior to Marx, was also a German philosopher who was influenced by Kant and Hegel. So to put it simply, the world is socially constructed. I don't know how to make this simple. The German philosophy is so abstruse. It's so complicated. The world is socially constructed. That is, the human mind concept has certain basic concepts or categories by means of which we organize our experience. So we don't know, for example, that there's actually objects or entities out in the world or causal relationships. But in our world, the human world, it always will be, because our mind structures it that way. If that makes any sense. That's Kant. Now to Kant, the human race, we're identical in that way. Our minds function identically. And so the basic concepts by means of which we organize our experience, for instance, entities or objects, cause and effect, we all structure the world the same way. Hegel accepts the idea that the world is socially constructed, but says, no, it evolves. Different societies and different time periods, have different basic concepts by means of which they organize experience and explain reality. So, for example, primitive tribes may see the world in terms of evil spirits or vengeful gods that have to be placated with live sacrifices, including of human beings. Medieval Christians might see in the world in terms of a loving God who can be prayed to and have faith in, and God will provide. Modern Westerners see the world in terms of natural laws that are unbreachable. They can't be changed. But different cultures, different time periods will organize their worlds differently. Now, Marx, who studied Hegel carefully, Marx says, well, even different classes within a society, different groups within a society will structure their world differently. Marx developed a theory known as polylogism, or many logics. And the owning class will construe the world in one way, and the working class will construe it very differently. So the owning class, the capitalists and their supporters see the world in terms of human free will and taking initiative, and we could rise up from poverty, and we could make ourselves successful by means of our own hard work. What Frederick Douglass spoke about, the self-made man, whereas according to Marx, the working class knows better. They know that what really decides how your life turns out is your birth, your class, oppression, class oppression, revolution, and so forth. So different classes see the world, different economic classes see the world differently. They structure it differently, they construe it differently, and there's no dictionary or translation. There's no way to communicate. There's no way to reason. There's no way to work out, these class struggles. All that could resolve it is, bloody revolution. Well, the postmodernists say the same thing, except they apply it more broadly. Men structure the world differently than do women. Whites see it differently than do non-whites. Straights see it differently than do gays, and so on. And there's no way to translate the different worldviews. It's just, we struggle. And we're gonna, there's out in the streets, Antifa's out in the streets, the leftist terrorist organization. No war but class war, eat the rich, the struggle against the white male oppressor, and so on and so on and so on. And so that's postmodernism, and it's a seething cauldron of cultural conflict. you know.
So basically, we've seen different incarnations of Marxism define the oppressor versus the oppressed dynamic very narrowly, according to their particular, worldview. So Marx identified it in the struggle in terms of class, and the critical theorists and Gramsci viewed it in terms of social constructs and culture. But when the postmodernists came into vogue, they defined it as anything you could think of.
Absolutely.
So you
Look
can
how-
whatever your imagination thought of in order to create a conflict, and that you could successfully imagine an oppressor versus an oppressed side, then good, you can claim it. It could be
and-
sexuality, gender,
Absolutely.
whatever.
Yeah, right. And just think about how stupid it is. You know, I mean, I'm not just mistaken, it's really dumb. I mean, if you think about it for 2 seconds, because you two are married. So you probably had any number of times where you sat down and you communicated, and you went back and forth, and you understood each other, had a meeting of the minds, and you opened your hearts and a meeting of the minds. I mean, that happens all the time. Men and women, especially in romantic relationships, they may fight a lot and they may get divorced and stuff, but they also, a lot of times, they have a meeting of the mind and the heart. They understand each other. They may agree on all kinds of things. It happens every day. According to the postmodernists, that would be impossible.
It's really interesting to look at postmodernism. One thing that I recall from when I was in school, I have a degree in art history and anthropology. And so postmodernism was kind of always up front in the theory. And I always wanted to be a little more Aristotelian in my own ideas. But one thing is that there's no objective truth. So there
Right.
is,
That's
everything is, it's all about, it's interesting because it's all about your path or your experience or what you see, and then that becomes truth. But if you look at the sort of evolution of Marxism into Neo-Marxism, from what the Frankfurt School did with critical theory, and then eventually, and I know we're not there yet, to critical race theory, they sort of take away the individual's power. But the postmoderns, they take away the power of the individual because everybody's oppressed, but they also grant it back that there is no objective truth, which is how you get all this revisionist history being taught in schools as truth, because, well, how do we know? We can't know about the past. That's not true.
No, they just make it up as they go along.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I should have made that point. Thank you, Dr. D. There's no objective truth. Truth is subjective. It's relative. It changes from group to group. Your group determines how you see the world.
Yeah.
And this is why they could say things like, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, because blacks are supposed to, see the world in a certain way. If you don't, you're a race traitor. Thomas Sowell, or Larry Elder, or Walter Williams.
Yeah, they called Larry Elder the white face of
Black,
or the black face of white
supremacy.
nationalism. Yeah.
White supremacy.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, these people are insane.
But so just to really nail down the value of understanding this, because it's absurd, it's insane. Well, why do we even look at it when we can see it for what it is? We can also see how it influences the decision makers and the drivers of culture. So if we have a philosophy, and not, when I say we, I don't mean us on this call. I mean, when you have the forces of culture with a philosophy that has no claim to objective truth, and it's just group warfare, whatever group you identify with, how does that change the culture? What does that turn the culture into?
It's tribalism. I mean, it really just, you are either with me or against me. And it's basically, it's just groups fighting against groups. It's chaos. It's, and that's why we get so much nihilism. It's because this is my experience and you can't see this and you can't feel it. And so even if you try to, then it's appropriation and you're wrong. And so there's no way, like what Dr. Andy was saying, with, connecting and talking and having that dialogue. This, all that does is tear it apart, because you cannot have dialogue, because I am, of Northern European ancestry, and I have not walked in your shoes, therefore I can't even try. And if I try, by even eating the food that your, culture has, I'm now appropriating. And so all it does is just shut it down. There's no room for discussion anymore. And it all comes back to this idea of either you're an oppressor or you're a victim. And if you're a victim, then you have to, you want to be emancipated, but you can't do that as an individual. And I don't know, if you want to get into CRT.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a short step to critical race theory from here.
It really is. So from the postmoderns and coming out of that era of the 1960s, when they were really publishing and they're really kind of coming up with these ideas, you have in America the civil rights movement. And so in the 1970s, you have a whole group of people that come out with this idea of critical race theory. And Richard Delgado is the lead, like the one whose name I remember the most. And you can read the book and you can read the articles that they publish, but it actually comes out of law. And what they, interestingly enough, they are against the civil rights movement. They don't think that Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is good or valid. They're saying that you can't do that, and it's not valid because because of the white sort of culture or enterprise or government or policymakers or whatever you want to say, this idea of colorblindness or, trying to rise up as an individual. We have heroes, African-American heroes across centuries, or, a couple centuries, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Madam C.J. Walker. Their stories aren't valid because there's no way to ever get power, because the power structure is so dominated and controlled by, going back by these white men. And so even if you want to sort of, rise up, or if you want to think about a meritocracy, they argue that it's not valid because it's still the white people that are setting what this meritocracy is. They set the levels, they set the standards. So basically, critical race theory is setting up, and it doesn't just apply to Blacks, it's Native Americans, and it's even crossed, into gender. So gays, trans, everything is against the entire structure. So the only way to win is to tear down that structure. It's basically, like the idea of the French Revolution, it's the guillotine. The only way to win, because if you have a meritocracy, it's still that cultural institution that sets what good or bad is by, this is worth merit. This is why, you get an A, which if you want to pull that, into modern education, if you think about the last year and a half, I kept hearing about schools saying, we are not going to issue grades, or we don't have Fs anymore. We're going to issue E's, or we're going to do away with grades, or we will just have needs improvement. And so this idea of ranking students by ability, that is bad because it's all this cultural institution that is the oppressor. And we have to not buy into anything that oppressor says or does or has instituted as, this is reality.
Because by rising in power, you become part of the dominant oppressor group.
Exactly, which is why Larry Elder is the white face or the black face of white supremacy, because he's trying to rise, and have this sort of meritocracy or do something that doesn't fit into, we are victims, we are oppressed, and we have to fight the man.
which
And it's
is
particularly,
ironically the most racist thing that you could ever
yeah,
believe.
absolutely. It's
Absolutely.
particularly insane because the idea is, if you excel, let's say as a writer or in math or, and you really master history, achieving in these fields, this is a white male mentality that's a good thing, right? This is what you were saying, Dr. D. And so even if you excel and rise, and you're the professor, you're a black woman and you're the professor and you have all these white kids, in your college class, so you're an authority figure. It doesn't matter. You've bought into the white man's, way of thinking, right? That makes you a race traitor.
Right, or sell out, or there
Yeah,
are so
right.
many, Uncle Tom, which is really a wretched thing that people are using to label people that they feel, well, you're not a victim. And it's really what's happened is the celebration of the victim. And what CRT has done and is doing, and what's the sort of what I see as madness that's running rampant in America, and it's spreading to other countries because you've seen, or I don't know if you have, but I've seen images like in England, them holding BLM signs in England, right? And all it does is it puts everything down to race, which is one of the most superficial things. I've given the archaeology analogy, I think, in a previous podcast, but that is just really descriptive. It has nothing to do with character. It has nothing to do with the individual, with their mind, which this frontal lobe is what separates us from those farm animals that get prodded, right? We have this
Yeah.
extra frontal lobe in our brain that gives us the ability to think and think as humans. And that's what
No,
really
you're
separates.
right. You're right, Dr. D. Judging people by race eliminates the most important characteristic of human beings, the choices we make, the moral choices we make as individuals.
So I want to just jump into a definition, and in a certain sense, I've kind of buried the lead here, but I have a definition for critical race theory that was proposed by a PhD in chemistry that sounds a little weird. His name's Neil Shenvi, and why would he have anything to say about this as a chemist? But he's actually well versed in critical race theory. He's a
Well,
homeschooling advocate.
Joel, as a chemist, he wouldn't have anything to say about it. But as a
Yeah.
rational thinking human being, he could have a lot to say about it.
But the definition is useful because critical race theory adherents take great pains to not define what their theoretical construct is.
Imagine being so ashamed of your history that you don't want to tell the truth about it. Or, we don't want to tell people don't want critical race theory taught. They don't want to tell the truth about Jim Crow and segregation in the South, as if critical race theory was about telling the truth about history.
Yeah.
It isn't, right? It's philosophy. It's not history. It's philosophy. And
Deanna is well versed in this this dynamic because of her going through her doctoral program, where critical race theory was like atmosphere. It's like what water is to fish. When you are steeped in it, you have no idea that that's what you're breathing and swimming in. But let me give you this definition, and we can use it to see what the connection is to Marx. And so here's Neil Shenvi's definition. He says, critical race theory is an ideology which divides the world into dominant oppressor groups and subordinate oppressed groups. So there's our oppressor versus the oppressed relationship. Groups along the lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, physical ability, and at this point there are ellipses. So you could probably add a few more groups here, but the point is that there are dominant oppressor groups and subordinate oppressor groups or oppressed groups that are divided into these various lines that are endless. This theory sees oppressed groups as being subordinated to oppressor groups by something it calls hegemonic power. And so that's a shout out to Gramsci. And hegemonic culture, which is the ability of the dominant group to impose its values on the culture. So I see here in this definition and again, this is not coming from an adherent of critical race theory, I see in this definition not only the Marxist underpinnings of oppressor versus oppressed power dynamics, but also the metaphysical hopelessness of Gramsci, in that you are doomed to stay in your group, particularly if you're one of the oppressed, with no hope of rising above it. Good people will try to tear down the oppressor groups as a moral imperative. So that's where we are today. This is the theory that is highly influential. In fact, if you are going through a teacher's college, you cannot escape it. And this might be a good time to tell the story of how Deanna tried to do her dissertation and come up with a theoretical framework for it. CRT, critical race theory, is everywhere, and you can't escape it when you go through the teachers' colleges. And when I say that, what I mean is that when you go to create and write your dissertation, you have to use a theoretical framework lens in order to present your study and your findings, right?
Absolutely. You have to have a theoretical approach, and it's expected to be a critical theoretical approach.
So you can't even use some other objective standard. You are, at least in your program, and is it possible that there are other teachers' colleges that might be more open to using a different theoretical framework?
There may be.
But that wasn't your experience.
Not my experience. I had to find
and not that I've heard of.
Yeah, so I took, and how I know so much about critical race theory and Richard Delgado and all of this is because I used critical race theory, but instead of looking at race, I looked at ideas. So it was critical idea theory,
and
which is ridiculous.
Yeah, and you used Ayn Rand or professors who taught Ayn Rand as a marginalized class.
Yes, they were my oppressed group because
and that's how you got away with it.
You know, let me say a few things here. One of our buddies, Professor Jason Hill from Jamaica. Black Jamaican.
Chicago guy.
DePaul University. Mm-hmm. He wrote that essay, I think it was in Salon, Black, Jamaican, and gay, and Ayn Rand made it okay. It was only, he was Black, Jamaican, and gay. Only reason Salon had anything positive to say about Ayn Rand. But he has said publicly, the discrimination he has suffered in the United States has not been because he's Black or an immigrant or gay, but because he's an Ayn Rand scholar and he's an objectivist. That's the discrimination that he's faced. But I just want to make a few last points because I know we're running out of time. Yeah, I mean, one of my heroes, Dr. Ben Carson, right? World-class brain surgeon, innovated new techniques for brain surgery for children, saved I don't know how many lives in his career, but he doesn't act like a member of the oppressed. And so he's called, by the Marxists, he's called the race traitor and a house Negro and all these horrible things. He's just one vivid example. But this is a very abstract theory. And so for a lot of people, I just want to bring it down to earth, how CRT is taught at sea level, in real time, in the schools. There's really two basic principles they teach. One, America in 2021 is a nation of systemic racism. As if it was still 1921 and Jim Crow was rampant and non-whites were oppressed. Overlooking, what's happened since then is the rise of a Black middle class, heroes like Ben Carson and Thomas Sowell, and people like that who've had, and many others who've had prominent careers. The tremendous diminution of white supremacists, the Klan is happily very diminished, and so on and so forth. America is still a nation of systemic racism, and non-whites are oppressed. That's one claim that CRT emphasizes, which is just false. But then the other claim is worse than false. It's irrational racist filth, and that is the claim that white people are all inherently racist. That it's hardwired into the makeup of any white person to be a racist towards non-whites. That's pure determinism. There's no free will. There's no choices that any white person can make to rise out of that. White people are inherently racist. It's a pure racist theory, and this is the kind of filth that they want to teach in the schools. It's not history, it's philosophy. That's why when people say, these Marxists say, you're so ashamed of your history, you don't want to teach the truth about history. That's a canard. That's a complete, total, and utter lie. I think everybody here and most Americans want the truth about American history told. Tell the truth about slavery, tell the truth about Jim Crow, tell the truth about lynchings, tell the truth about all these horrendous atrocities perpetrated against Black Americans and white Americans and so forth. Also tell the full truth, by the way, that the principle of individual rights is what led to an abolitionist movement and the 13th Amendment and so on and so forth. And the principle of individual rights is the panacea for racism in any form. But tell the full truth about American history. This is not about, critical race theory is not about history. They lie, claiming that it's about teaching the truth about American history. It's about philosophy. It's about claiming that America is a nation of systemic racism, and the most insidious, just vile lie of all, that white people are intrinsically racist. That's what CRT is all about. That's why it's evil, and that's why it has to be kept out of the schools.
And we can see that from the reaction to, as proof of America's non-racist nature, we can see how people shrink away with or by accusations of racism. So, and this is one of the biggest issues that many people face, is that mere accusations of racism will cause you to shrink away and not fight back. And what hopefully we've done here on this podcast is to show where the real roots of all of this come from, so that if you are attacked, you can properly diagnose it and diffuse it and understand where it comes from.
Yeah, there's the thing. You're right. Critical race theory, we've been discussing it. It's the oppressor and the oppressed paradigm is pure Marxism. And it always, I always point out to the Marxists, well, you're criticizing the United States, for slavery. All right, slavery is evil, and it was real in the United States. But you're overlooking the fact that the principle of individual rights, put forth by slave owners like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, so they were hypocrites, and there's a contradiction there. But there's also magnificent good there that led to an abolitionist movement and end of slavery. You're not only overlooking that, but you're a bunch of freaking Marxists who support communist practice, which every communist country in history, including to this day, practices slave labor. The gulags are filled with slave labor of innocent people. Very often they're political prisoners. Maybe they criticize the regime, or maybe they only suspected of it, but they're at hard labor in the gulags, and you're supporting this. You're a bunch of goddamn hypocritical, dishonest liars. That's what I would respond to if somebody accused me of being, one of these creatures accused me of being a racist.
Well, they're not just liars, right? Their theoretical construct forces them to overlook the Declaration of Independence and the Emancipation Proclamation, because
and the Bill of Rights.
Yes, and in their worldview, in their theoretical framework, they cannot have victims that overcome. They need victims in order to maintain their beliefs. So they don't just overlook it. They purposefully and studiously avoid it in order to maintain the impossibility of ever resolving the oppressor versus oppressor conflict. So it has to be that way.
Right, you're right.
There's a really interesting sort of a statement, and I'm going to paraphrase, by a man named Dr. Wyatt Walker. And he was a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he argues against critical race theory. And he says that what it's doing is that it is intentionally, explicitly putting these groups of individuals, whether it's race or gender or sexuality or whatever it is, those oppressed groups, it is pitting them against other people who supposedly have the power. So, and what that does is that it's focusing on these differences and what I call superficial differences, because I think the differences of the mind and actually using your mind and not just shutting it down and going along with the, group think, but to think about individually and to rationally think through these issues. He says it focuses on the differences and not the similarities. And by doing that, the idea of the individual is completely thrown out. And you can't talk to an individual because you are my enemy, because you hold the power, or because we are not the same. And so even though you have Blacks or the Latinx or whatever, that community, or the Native American community, they're also being pitted against each other because you are not part of my group and don't pretend to be. Don't pretend to understand. And that goes back to that idea of the postmoderns, is that this is my view, not yours. You cannot even try to empathize or sympathize with this experience.
And this is perpetual, this creates perpetual conflict that can never be resolved. And it is anti-enlightenment in nature. As the human world discovered the power of reason, one of its great benefits was the ability to amicably resolve conflict. But this theoretical construct is as far away from that as possible in order to create perpetual conflict.
And there's one other thing I really want to point out, and we can, where I know we're have been talking for quite a while, and maybe we can address this in another episode, but there are now schools that are coming forward and saying, we're not teaching critical race theory, we're teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, that is just a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's the same thing, and these same ideas are going to be put forward. And you have first, second, third graders that are being taught to look at things and the differences, looking at race. And if you're a little white first grader, you're the problem. Think about that for a second.
Yeah, that's horrible.
That is child abuse, and that is not okay. So if you call your school, or you go to the PTA meeting, or you go to the school board meeting, they're like, we're not teaching critical race theory. It's just diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you know where that's coming from? That's coming from the accreditation. Schools have to get accredited, and it's the accreditation bodies that are requiring this DEI in schools. So this is the issue. This is government schooling, and it's also in private schooling, because the accreditation for private schooling often matches public schooling. And so if your school is saying, oh, we're just having diversity week where we're going to talk about diversity, exclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, keep your kids home from school. Let them play video games all day. It's going to be better for their brain. I guarantee it.
Or read a book. It's just, I know we're over time. It's just one last thing I wanted to say. And that is, to the extent that the schools are pushing this stuff, and they are, that they're not teaching, they're indoctrinating the kids. They're just, this is propaganda. This is the irony is, this is not history. This is not history. This is pure Marxist propaganda. And so this is what the government schools, and I think a lot of the private schools today also are doing. They're propagandizing. They're indoctrinating the kids with pure Marxist propaganda, and they're not teaching history, and they're certainly not teaching the true ideas that animated American history. The principle of individual rights that led to so many good things in this country, including the 13th Amendment. And we always point out, slavery still exists in many parts of the world. The Americans abolished it 150 years ago. It still exists, and especially exists, like I said, in every communist country favored by these Marxist intellectuals who are pushing this intellectual vomit onto elementary school children. So that's the last thing I wanted to say on this.
Well, on that note, if there's one thing we wanted to get across in this episode today is to be able to identify any descendant of Marx's oppressor versus oppressed construction. Learn to identify it, and that's where your enemy is. Properly diagnose it, and then you know what to do. Don't fall for your teachers when they say that they're just teaching about diversity. There's always a hidden agenda. So we will talk about similar issues in upcoming episodes, because there is no end. There's absolutely no end to the corruption. But until then, we'll try to adjourn with a happy face. Doctors Bernstein and Heikkinen, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Mr. Marquez. Always a pleasure to hobnob with you and Dr. D.
Don't forget to check out our website, rationaleducator.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Parler, and Rumble. Thanks for watching this episode of the Rational Educator Podcast. We'll see you next time.